you want me in a jacket and tie?
The peace deal negotiations are being held in?
I think that Zelensky is at, of course, a disadvantage because he has many of his people that he is responsible for essentially held hostage by Putin. So he has to weigh the value of their lives now against the importance of maintaining the principles that everybody is fighting for, of freedom and independence for Ukraine, sovereignty, right? The idea that we don't believe that you should use force to change borders. And these are very difficult things for a leader to weigh.
Negotiations are held in fair conditions, or could the conditions be changed somehow, and how?
I don't know. I have to think about that one for a second. Well, the negotiations are being held in an imbalanced way. So Zelensky is fundamentally in a worse position than Putin is, even though Putin has essentially lost on the battlefield. With the idea of conventional war, the winner on the battlefield is supposed to be able to walk into a negotiation in a stronger position. But because NATO is taking such a hands-off role here, it leaves Zelensky in a weaker position because whatever happens, Russia retains, right, a larger army. Russia remains a threat to a future Ukraine in a way that Ukraine does not remain a threat to Russia. And so he's fundamentally working under unfair conditions.
NATO and, say, collective West could do to make the conditions fair?
I think they need to seriously consider forcibly opening up humanitarian corridors into places like Mariupol and other cities that end up essentially being taken hostage by Putin. There is great risk to this, risk in the West that is calculated as the risk of moving into sort of some weapons of mass destruction or nuclear exchanges. But I think that there are ways for creative planners to mitigate that risk. And I think it's important that NATO signal that it's willing to do that, willing to defend its values in action in order to level the negotiating table between Zelensky and Putin, where Zelensky really can suggest that he has the power of NATO behind him in a way that he doesn't right now.
How will that not escalate the war, the military conflict going on?
I think that you can do things like if you tried. There are logistical issues, but let's pretend for a moment that we can solve those. If you were to take a NATO force and to insist to Putin that NATO is going to open up this evacuation corridor from the sea, and that if there's any interference from Putin on this operation, essentially in private, you would signal that Putin risks his Black Sea fleet. Now, that fleet is of incredible strategic importance to Putin's future plans, but it is of relatively little importance to his current plans now that he has troops on the ground and they're operating as a land force. So that puts him in a position of risking a critical future component for his plans, but not something that necessarily stops him on the ground today. So the West could pressure that, and I think get him to decide that it wasn't worth, keeping civilians in Mariupol and losing his Black Sea fleet, and that there's at least a reasonable chance that he would allow some sort of evacuation, even if it wasn't perfect. Anybody you can get out is better than nobody. And you could do things like, if you were going to target a Russian ship, you could either shoot to kill, or you could have an escalation ratchet. You could shoot to disable the ship. And if you did that and disabled it, that would give you a pause in the escalation and another opportunity to negotiate with Putin to say, stop interfering, allow this operation to go forward. That's one option. You could create similar sorts of plans in the West that would provide some sort of no-fly zone in places like Lviv and create these these safe harbor places. Now, I don't think that having a no-fly zone with NATO aircraft is necessarily the only way to do this. I think if you get in anti-air weapons and counter-battery radar systems for Ukrainian artillery, you can effectively create a no-fly zone from the ground up. And I think if you look, most of the losses have been taken from artillery and missiles and not from bombing. And so I think you could sort of thread the needle and create what Ukraine needs while limiting the escalation risk, because you're not actually putting NATO jets in the air. And if you decided to put NATO jets in the air later, you always could. So you can try option one to build these things out on the ground, and then move to option two if you had to. And I think that that's a way that NATO could put real power behind Ukraine with acceptable risk.
The negotiation process ending in a peace deal or rather in a truce deal?
That's the question. I think it goes back to whether or not Zelensky decides that his first priority is essentially to Ukrainians alive today, or if he has some priority to future Ukrainians in terms of defending principles, right, to create a stronger, freer Ukraine, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And so I think if he decides, and I don't know what the right answer is here, but if he's going to decide that it's more important to save the lives that he is leading today, then I think what you end up with is a truce. Then his goal is to stop the fighting and stop the killing as soon as possible. And if he decides that it's important for him to try to really protect these principles, to win on these principles, then I think you see fighting continue. Russia has culminated. They are not able to prosecute their original strategic plan on the ground because Ukrainian forces have functionally defeated them. That can continue for some period of time, but it continues at the cost of civilian lives. And that's really the thing that Zelensky has to decide.
What do you think would be a win-win result for Ukraine in this negotiation process?
In the end, this is a war of independence for Ukraine that started in, say, 2004 and is reaching its zenith now. In that time, the Ukrainian people have managed to create an imperfect but functioning democracy, an imperfect but functioning, market economy. And what you see today is a society that has really committed itself at all levels, right, in all spheres of activity, to being a free and independent Ukraine. And Ukraine will win. And I don't mean that as a Ukrainian patriot. I mean that as a political scientist, that the dominant factor in this war is not weapons, right? It's morale, or rather it is the commitment of the average Ukrainian to continue to fight. It is their will to fight that wins or loses this war. And that will to fight is 1,000 times greater in Ukraine than in Russia, because Russian soldiers aren't fighting for anything meaningful. They're fighting for a hallucination, right? They're fighting for a dictator that they don't believe in. And that's why you've seen the morale problems. That's why you've seen, the surrenders on this end. But I think that Ukraine ends up liberating Russia. This may not happen the moment the guns stop in Ukraine. It may happen a year from then. It may take 20 years, 30 years. But in the end, what's happening now, sooner or later, never mind the Kremlin's information blackout, is Russians are beginning to get information. They're feeling the impact of things like sanctions, and they're recognizing that the Putinist government is not governing with their consent. And sooner or later, enough people will decide that it is worth the risk to their lives, just like so many Ukrainians have decided it is worth the risk to their lives, to fight a corrupt government, to overturn it, and to build some kind of European democratic free government. That could take decades yet, but in the end, that is the only answer for Russia. If that does not happen, right, then Russia and the Russian people are doomed. But I believe that it will happen. I do believe that there are enough of those values in Russian culture, right, just like in Ukrainian culture, that if they are given a chance to emerge from the history of the Soviet Union, they can be successful. So I think in the end, right, this ends on the streets of Moscow, and 10, 20 years from now, historians will look back and they will say that the Ukrainian War of Independence started the Russian War of Independence.
52 of the Vienna Convention says that any deal, any decision, any contract, any agreement signed under the barrel of a gun is deemed nil and void.
I mean, no. So the thing about warfare is all war is extra legal. There's really no such thing as international law. There are international norms, but they're not easily enforced as law. So what tends to happen in wars is that both sides commit to a ceasefire. And so under the logic that no one is shooting at each other during a ceasefire, then it is understood that the leaders who sign those agreements are not, in fact, doing it under the barrel of a gun. Under the barrel of a gun means if one side refuses to commit a ceasefire and essentially, says, I will obliterate this city if you don't agree to these terms, right? And there's no meaningful negotiation, then that would be seen as being void by the international community. But again, it's not really legal because the international community could decide that it wants to view it as legal because it's in their best interest. And so you can see these kinds of situations. Now, I think that Ukraine has leverage at the negotiating table, but it doesn't have what it should have because of what I said before. It doesn't have the leverage it should have because Zelensky is a good leader, because the Ukrainian government, his advisors are good leaders, and they care about the lives of their people, and they're not necessarily willing to risk more of those lives in order to change the negotiating position.